Let's get straight into the discussion. Foreign Correspondents Club, India and the world, how India views the world and how the world views India. Let me start with Amy Casman because you're a foreign correspondent stationed here in India. Amy, what are the difficulties in covering a complex country like India? There is the Western view of India, great big democracy, a billion plus people. It's always been the great big hope. And yet there are so many contradictions in this country. There are huge religious and ethnic fault lines. A third of the country still lives in abject poverty. How are you able to capture these complexities to a foreign audience?
Thank you very much for your question. I think, to be very honest, it's always a very daunting task because on any one day, there are so many different things to write about. Even in the last few weeks, we have struggled with, major stories of global interest in India, which are India's response to the coronavirus, how the economy is, massively contracting as a result of one of the world's strictest lockdowns. And at the same time, you have, unprecedented border tensions along the border with China. And then, at the same time, you have a government that is very eager to downplay all problems and say that everything is kind of chugging along fine. And so there's a lot of challenges and difficulties, and in terms of choosing stories, when to write about which issue, like an overwhelming amount of work, essentially. And I think that, you also have, I feel, increasingly a massive disconnect between what the international media considers news and what, say, electronic media in India considers news. There is a growing diversion between what we consider the stories that the world wants to know about India and the kind of stories that Indian journalists, especially I want to emphasize on electronic media, are covering for the domestic audience. So and the recent weeks have highlighted that magnificently, that at a time when there have been these massive issues of national importance, the only story on television media has been about Sushant Singh Rajput and what happened to him and who did what to him. And when we're looking around and saying, my God, the economy is, contracted 24% in the first quarter, it's projected to contract 10% for the whole year. What are the implications of that? What's happening on the border? Are tensions escalating or de-escalating? And, the television media is just on and on and on about a tragedy, a serious tragedy for those who are involved with him, but not necessarily a national tragedy of national import. So these are challenging times for the international media, and the growing disjuncture between, kind of the domestic news choices that they're making and what we as foreign correspondents would make, because the world wants to know how India is doing. The world is interested in geopolitics of the great rivalry between India and China. So anyway, these are some of the challenges we face, and I guess we overcome it by working hard and trying to maintain faith in our own judgment about what's important and what matters, and trying to really get to the heart of important issues that really are of national import to India and the whole narrative about where is India going on the global stage.
All right, thank you for that, Amy. I guess we leave the electronic media aside because it's got a mind of its own. Let me go to Suhasini Haidar. Obviously, the biggest story in your beat over the last 4 months has been the India-China border standoff. How do you draw the line, if you will, between A, covering the story, and B, there is only limited information available on that story because no journalist can actually go to the LAC. There is no concept of even going with the truth down to where the action is happening. And yet at the same time, there is an imperative to tell the truth. And there will also be some amount of pushback from the government because there are national security implications, quote unquote, to it. So how do you balance the two?
Well, To start with, Zaka, I think we have to understand that, in fact, people think they are getting more news today than they got before, simply because of social media, simply because of real-time media, simply because there's just so much out there. In fact, what's happening is much of this is being used, in a sense, to actually constrict the kind of information people are getting. And what has happened, honestly speaking, because of this race of eyeballs and because of the idea that we must show the viewer, reader, or listener what they already want to hear, the actual straits, the channels of information have actually narrowed rather than broadened. It is very obvious in exactly the question you asked me and what Amy said earlier, because clearly for anyone looking outside in, and to be honest, for analysts looking inside in as well over here, the three biggest challenges that India faces, and India is not alone in some of those, but the three biggest challenges India faces are the situation at the line of actual control with China, are our economy, and all the troubles that we are had. And we cannot, sort of just say everybody's got this problem, because India is clearly suffering more when it comes to its economic recovery than everyone else. And then we have the coronavirus issue, where India is now the second largest number of cases. We're hitting all the charts in terms of where coronavirus is spread as well. Given that situation, the idea that, in fact, we can focus on any one story or any one issue the way we have been doing gives to me the idea that actually people are living with less information and are happy to live with the less information, or they don't know what they don't know, and they seem to be okay with it. Now, when it comes to the China situation, and I know you wanted to ask specifically about that, the truth is, compared to every other conflict in the past, we have less access. Journalists even going as far as Leh, which is, hundreds, if not 1,000 kilometers away from some of the points of conflict, even there, journalists are not allowed to move beyond basic public spaces. There's a lot of censorship when it comes to the reporting. And yet, the information coming out is actually proving that at every stage the government has not told us the entire truth. If in April, as we now know, Chinese troops were amassing, why is it that in May we had government officials come out and say there's nothing new going on over here? Why is it even after the Galwan clashes, in fact, until the Galwan clashes, we didn't have a government statement saying anything really strange was happening, and that it could not be fixed? 20 Indian soldiers die. Our entire focus is on somehow proving that enough Chinese soldiers died so that we can brush this effect away. I know I'm sounding extremely cynical, but what I'm saying, Zaka, is journalism is being done by a few people trying to get those stories out. Some of them are, in fact, the international media based in India. And it is doing it against all odds, because there is zero information. There is zero access. There are abject denials, there are blatant denials of stories that later turn out to be true. It's eventually becoming more and more difficult. So if I was a consumer of news today, I should actually be very angry about the fact that I'm getting much less on this particular incident, where it seems as if very major things have changed. Not in 45 years have gunshots been fired. Not in 45 years have people been killed. Not since 1962 has this part of the LAC been live. Hundreds of kilometers, if not more than 1,000 of patrolling area that India used to be able to patrol, no longer available to India. And yet the reader is actually getting less information on something so major than they got on conflicts, at the LOC with Pakistan, or any of the things that we saw in the past. So I'm trying to give you a sense of the frustration one feels, because it's not just that people are watching the very tragic suicide, murder, whatever, of a Bollywood actor, and suddenly expressing huge surprise that recreational drugs have been used in Bollywood. I mean, it's completely shocking. And it is that every channel and every journalistic, not every, I shouldn't say just every, but so much of the media is being consumed by this, that there is little space for some of the most important stories of our time.
All right, let me go across to Alex now, and again, somebody who looks at India from an economist's point of view. The pandemic and the resultant contraction of the economy by about 25% almost. The great big Indian economic hope, the so-called counterweight to China. How do you see India, getting out of this pandemic? There are countries that will emerge certainly stronger. I think you look at the numbers in China; they're already in positive growth. The US certainly has been in negative growth, but by virtue of the fact that it is the biggest economy in the world, the US will be fine as well. How do you see the Indian economic story emerging out of this pandemic, given what we've seen in the first quarter?
Thank you, Zaka. Although I have to start by excusing myself from too much understanding of the economic scene. I'm not myself an economist. We have a correspondent. It's sort of funny breakdown of roles that we have at The Economist, whereby we have, for South Asia and many other parts of the world, a dedicated finance and economics correspondent. I write more often about politics across the states. And a strange effect of the pandemic is that our economics correspondent has been, in effect, stuck outside the country, having been in New York when pandemic crisis began. Anyway, I do follow our coverage and sometimes contribute to it as far as the economy goes. And I would say that as shocking as the headline figures are, the stories are getting short shrift in our pages and the pages of all of the foreign press I read. And largely because, I mean, as with Suhasini was just describing the way that news from the LAC is passing through a very, very tight bottleneck between limited access and active misinformation. We're getting all kinds of nonsense through the government and official friendly sources, which make it hard to see what's happening there. There's a lesser extent to which that's also true of the economy. I would say that if India is facing three great crises right now between the economy, the border, the coronavirus, you must add a fourth, which is institutional capture by the central government, which is, of course, one of the main reasons why we don't know what's happening at the LAC, why judiciary is a lot more, let's say, interesting and also less interesting than it has been in previous years, and also why the economy is so obscure to those of us who are stuck in Delhi or in New York, watching what indicators are available to us. With NSSO and other statistical reports, I mean, granted, it's much more difficult to collect all kinds of information in the field. All kinds of information is changing more rapidly than it ever has before. And this is true around the world, more so in India than any other country I see. It becomes very hard to get a view of what's going on. So let me get back to your question. I won't bet on anything other than very hard times ahead. As for the contrast between India, China, some of the Western countries, you have to look at the fact that our coronavirus caseload here is not only still on the way up, now beating the world at a daily rate, but this is the only large country where it's never gone down, going up every single day. Each day now we record more cases of infection than China has since the virus was discovered. So it's quite fruitless to draw a comparison between a country like China and India. I think instead what we have to see is whether India will find a way to recover while suffering mass illness and presumably death. The rate of contraction is sure to decrease, but that's the only good news we can find right now. What I would be most eager to do, and the limitations of my reporting are such that I can't right now, is to see all different parts of the country. I mean, to spend much more time on the road in villages, small towns, tier 2 and 3 cities, to see how different sectors are reacting. As Nainan put in a column in the Biz Standard weeks ago, it's looking a lot like a K-shaped recovery. where some parts of the economy are actually going to do quite well. I'm surprised and pleased at how well agriculture seems to be taking this quarter, whereas other parts are just falling off the cliff. We hear much about it.
All right. Thanks for that. I guess it'll be a while before you can hit the road and go to parts of India other than the big cities. Let me go to Nimisha. And you again have a unique challenge, Nimisha, because you're telling the India story to a German audience and to a European audience. And one of the problems, the eternal problems in that has always been, much of the idea of Germans about India, much of the idea of Europeans about India, even Americans to a great extent, is shaped by some amount of stereotypes, if you will, because of the diaspora, whether it is Bollywood, whether it is yoga, curry, what have you. How do you break those stereotypes? How do you convey to your audience stories about India that sometimes do not fit their mental image of India?
Thank you, Zaka. Definitely that has been a challenge because our audiences are not just in Germany and Europe, but across the world. And I think all foreign correspondents essentially, especially in a country like India, have this responsibility of explaining context without making it too simplistic. So for example, there are certain topics that I, as a broadcast journalist, I'm too afraid to touch. I mean, if we come across some caste-related policy changes, to explain that in a 3.5 minute story is a near impossible task. And at first goes through a layer of scrutiny of analysis through our editors. And if our editors themselves find it a bit too inside ball for us to explain on air, we usually end up having to circumvent those stories. However, there are stories which are too important for us to pass up, and we have to make a special effort to ensure that those explanations are coming through and that context is being explained while keeping language that is international and is easily understandable for all our viewers. Now, of course, it's also a bit of a minefield. Personally, for me, I'm actually coming to foreign correspondents from an Indian national TV background. And there's language that we use so comfortably, so easily here in India, having grown up with an Indian education, worked for an Indian TV channel, that is a complete minefield when you look at how we need to represent India in an international context. I mean, favorite subject, Kashmir, if we look at that, the fact that in India, we so easily talk about it, Pakistan administered Kashmir as Pakistan occupied Kashmir. In Pakistan, it's talked so easily about as Azad Kashmir. That language cannot be used when you are an international correspondent, and that is something which viewers are looking at very closely, and there's a lot of pushback that can be expected. Personally, for me, I've also received criticism for not being Indian enough when I'm doing such kind of coverage, because I'm not being honest with or supportive of the Indian government narrative. And as Amy was saying, there is a contrast between how Indian media is covering most issues and how foreign correspondents are covering most issues. And there's also a bit of a pushback as a consequence of that. I mean, we have international media being viewed as too critical of the Indian government, of the Modi government, even if we try to balance those views out. So it's quite a dance to basically play out. On the one hand, you have to go to the people to ensure that all these narratives, ranging from the NRC to the CAA to the coronavirus to the crisis of migrants, are all being covered and explained, and you're hearing from the people. On the other hand, we also have to ensure that the government's perspective is also coming in. And there is an added responsibility almost, because the Indian media is largely being seen as biased, and we are free of having those kind of biases and influences. But on the other hand, with that privilege comes a responsibility that we don't end up biasing to the other side, that we're not seen simply as a media that is looking to criticize how India operates, how the Indian government operates, and feed into stereotypes. There's a responsibility that we are not just showing a poor nation, a struggling nation, and that these issues have been covered while also looking at what the government is doing without being too heavy-handed or too light on the other hand, and basically keeping it honest, essentially.
All right, thanks for that, Nimisha. Parul, you've been covering Indian diplomacy and Indian diplomats for many number of years now. And I guess at some level, the part of a diplomat's job is to try and oversell the idea of India as this great investment destination, this great big hope, big democracy, so on and so forth. And like I keep saying, and I'm sure you've heard this from the George Bush years, the big counterweight to China. And your job, I guess, at some points is to try and prick that every once in a while. How do you to find that balance, especially when, like Suhasini said, access to information is very limited. Source-based reporting is frowned upon these days. So how do you deal with that contradiction, that inherent challenge in your?
Zaka, covering the external affairs ministry is like walking a minefield. I think I'm sure you would know because you've also been part of that experience. So you have to walk the fine line between getting information and perhaps not really upsetting your sources or the information that you're getting, because I've covered various other ministries in my career, and nowhere else are there such huge sensitivities involved as in the coverage of the MEA, because they get how you cover, who you attribute your story to, and in fact they're very sensitive about China, I must say, because even if you write things like India is doing this, say in Bangladesh or Nepal, because China is making huge inroads, they don't like it. Because India would like to believe that what it's doing in these nations is a standalone thing. So they do not want to be compared to China. And I must share a very interesting experience. This was about a decade ago, when the MEA had actually held a briefing to tell us, please don't write too many anti-China stories, because when you do that, they think that we are giving you all this information. So it was that kind of sensitivity involved then. And about a decade down the line, now when you have this face-off between India and China, and when Suhasini, as she mentioned, that there's lack of information coming out of the government, I think it's not just to do with a particular ministry. It's also got to do with the general stand of the government, a basic lack of transparency, restricted information. They don't, for the first 2 months, I think until Galwan happened, the government was trying to give the message that there was actually no intrusion at all, until Galwan happened and 20 Indian soldiers died. And I would also like to bring in this fact that unlike previous governments, we've had a scene where we've had a prime minister who hasn't held a press conference in the last, say, 6 years. So basically, the flow of information is based on tweets. We do have statements from the MEA, thank God for that, or information. But in general, there is restricted flow of information. There was a practice of, say, holding briefings after bilateral meetings, where both sides would take questions. That doesn't happen anymore. It hasn't happened for the last 6 years. So where do you get your information? You get it from your sources or people you know, and that's how you need to walk. And then you're walking on glass, because you also have to be careful not to shut off all doors, because they shut very swiftly when it comes to writing on foreign affairs.
All right. Okay. One of the things I miss is those onboard briefings when, the cameras are off and people are much more relaxed and willing to share off-record stuff. But anyway, that doesn't happen.
Zaka, if I may add to that,
sure.
You spoke about onboard briefings, and you see there was a practice of journalists going on board the PM's trips abroad, and that was stopped on the grounds that, okay, you better pay for your reporter traveling with the prime minister. But the fact was that the aircraft was going half empty anyway. So journalists were, yes, getting a free ride, but they were paying for this.
It's still going half empty.
Yeah, it's going half empty. I'm glad you pointed that out, Suhasini. So, now you say that, look, we won't take you because we don't want these free rides. You ask the organization to pay, which they are willing to do for the journalist stay. But going on those trips was not just a junket. It meant that you had access to the NSA, the foreign secretary, other senior officials, and even the prime minister, who would take questions on board. So that's gone for a toss now.
All right. So I'm going to go to some audience questions now, and Shubha sent me these questions. So I don't know who in the audience has sent these questions. So nonetheless, I'm going to go into the first question, and this is to Suhasini. Of late, journalists have been using social media to share information gathered from quote-unquote sources. This trend has been particularly apparent with Indian foreign policy journalists. The Balakot strikes, the Uri strikes being a couple of such instances. Would you like to comment on this trend?
Well, absolutely. And I share the reader's frustration because obviously you don't want to be in a situation where you are constantly reporting or reading reports that are just source-based. A senior level source, a government source, an official source. It is tiring because we now see multiple sources quoted for the same article where you're literally saying the first source said this and then the second source said, it is absolutely a slippery slope and a very, very dangerous trend because as we know, eventually everybody can just say sources said. But I would posit it to you, is it not surprising that we now live in times where the government at the highest levels, even when they hold briefings, even when they give you information, will not own up to it? So what is really strange to me is that we are now briefed even at the ministerial level with ministers telling us you cannot attribute this to anyone. I've never seen this in a 25-year career. We no longer have that idea of door-stopping ministers anywhere. Tell me the last time you saw a senior level official being door-stopped. Whereas I can remember a time where the External Affairs Minister's door would open at 8 a.m. and the television channels would be outside there getting bites on what was the story of the day. Okay, so it has changed. There's a lot more media now. There's a lot of other channels by which the government prefers to put its versions out. The fact that officials today will not put their name to a story, to me, is surprising. Let me give you one single example, and this should tell the person who asked the question, I didn't catch his name or her name, what we are living in. A week ago, the External Affairs Minister of India and the Foreign Minister of China met in Moscow. They put out a 5-point agreement at, I think it was close to 3 a.m. India time. By 4 a.m., we had a source-based statement that came from the Chinese side that said so much more than the 5-point agreement said. By 5 a.m., we had a Ministry of External Affairs source-based statement that came out as well. So here we are covering what should have been the main thing, which is the 5-point agreement between the two. And instead we're going, but sources on this side said this and sources on that side. It became even more ridiculous because about 3 days later, both the foreign ministries actually put the source-based statement on their websites. So now you tell me how credible, how are we supposed to show how credible each source is when there's this kind of zigzag behavior going on with the government? I think there is only one answer. And yes, we must all insist that we cannot just go with sources said for anything. But I think there is a very important line to be put over here, and we do it editorially as well, that sources can give you information. They cannot give you opinions. Or if they give you opinions, then think twice before you report those opinions. Because if a source is not putting their name to that opinion, then don't report it. But if the source is giving you information, and we all need credible information, and it's a credible source, you sometimes get 2 sources on it, then by all means, you need to give your readers and viewers that information. So give them the information. But don't just take opinions. We have so many people who will just run the idea that, according to sources, country A is a disaster. According to sources, country B has completely, what are the words they love to use, a slap to so-and-so, a snub to so-and-so. Well, these are not things that you need to attribute to sources. These are just opinions. But if a source says 2 ministers will meet on a certain date, then obviously that is very important. Sure. So I think that that discrimination needs to come in from the journalist side as well as from the reader's side. When they look at a piece of information, eventually they will have to take a call on how seriously they're going to take it, because otherwise your WhatsApp will have exactly the same amount of credibility as a well-researched story that has had a lot of man hours and money put into it.
Sure. 2 questions to Amy and to Alex. So I'm going to read both of it. How do you prepare for an assignment like covering India? What are the books you read? Who do you speak to? How do you get a sense of the country's politics before and during your assignment? And the second question is, after the United States, India now probably has the world's largest set of speakers of English. How does that change the editorial decisions on the amount of coverage that you give to India, foreign news outlets give to India? So, Amy, you want to go first?
Okay, yeah. So I have to say that I first came to India so long ago in the mid-1990s, and I went away and then I came back again in 2008. So it's hard to even remember like how I prepared for coming. But I mean, I basically think that when you are a foreign correspondent, it is a constant process of learning and studying, and you meet as many people as you can from as many different backgrounds as you can. You read as much as you can. It's not like there's one book. And sometimes you decide that like urgently now, I mean, you could spend a lifetime studying India and never sort of know everything that there is to know. And I think we all have to be very humble about the complexities, the number of issues, and you know, in some ways we're like ping pongs, and you kind of dive in deep to a topic at a time when it's suddenly relevant about news. So for example, just the other day I asked a listening writer to please recommend me 4 books that I could read about the India-China War in 1962, because all of a sudden that seems really relevant. And until now, it didn't really seem as the most important priority of what I should be reading about, because there were, you know, it wasn't a massive focus of our attention. So I think there's a lot of, you know, at the time when an issue becomes important, you run to the Bari Sons and Con Market and like load up on books and like cram like for an exam basically. But I think it's a constant learning process. I mean, in 1999, I was here for like the Kargil conflict, and I learned a lot about artillery and how it works, because it was something I never knew about and I never needed to know about it. So I think you keep reading widely, you read the newspapers, you read books, you read authors that you respect, you know, you choose well. There's always going to be more than you can read. And I think, you know, it's a constant learning process that starts before you arrive. You read a few general books that, you know, some people recommend. I read my, you know, colleague Ed Luce's book, In Spite of the Gods, which was written, you know, years ago, but remains like a very insightful book. And, you know, you start reading generally and then you just keep reading. And depending on what's the issue and what's the topic at the moment, you read. And I forgot what was the second question.
About the fact that India has the second largest population of English speakers. Does that change editorial decisions?
I would say that it's not so much that India has the second largest population of English speakers that is really kind of the determining factor. I can tell you that our China bureau, where everyone's, you know, is 3 times bigger than our India bureau. There are at least, maybe this is actually a sore point, there are at least 3, maybe 4 times as many people that the FT devotes to covering China, where, as you know, English is not widely spoken, than it is to India. And our bureau here in India is the same size as the bureau in Japan, a country that is much smaller in population terms, but much more, you know, much bigger in terms of economic strength and, you know, global companies and stuff like that. So I think that the amount of coverage, I mean, over 20 years, the FT Bureau grew from 1 person in the 90s to basically 3 people, 3 full-time foreign correspondents now. And that growth is basically a reflection not of India as an English-speaking country or a country with a lot of English speakers, but a rating of its importance, you know, on the global stage. So, and kind of its growing importance in business, but still not as important as China, where, you know, there's loads more people assigned. So that's kind of what it's about India's heft, and it's also its global connectedness. And
All right.
can I just make one other point, because I think it's kind of relevant and it's something that is like important to me for people to understand. A lot of times issues are covered here, you know, maybe something that's not very positive occurs in India, and you know, the typical response that you hear on social media or from others is, you never read about these kinds of issues like when they happen in Pakistan. And I think that it is important for people to understand that the kind of coverage devoted to India and the kind of stories are covered are also a reflection of India's importance of the world and India's own claims about where it fits in the world, and its claim to kind of great power status or being a very important country on the world stage, which, you know, Pakistan obviously has regional strategic importance, but nobody is going to take any claim that it's really one of the rising powers on the global stage that everyone needs to pay attention to. So the kind of coverage of India is also the kind of coverage of India, the amount of coverage and the types of stories we cover is also heavily influenced by India's own claims about itself to be the world's largest democracy, to, you know, a liberal democracy with lots in common with the West and Western societies, and a rising power on the global stage. So I think the foreign media, you know, is active in trying to hold India, you know, to account, to living up to the standards that it professes to live by. So over to you,
right.
Alex.
Thanks, Amy. I'll try not to echo too much because I probably have a lot of the same things to say. Amy and I have both been coming to India since the 90s, so it's been too long and confusing a reading list to get into now. And I think we should also admit that the short reading list of books that, for instance, Amy or I might recommend to colleagues coming to India from abroad recently is a closely guarded trade secret, and also probably kind of revealing, we'd wish. And it changes. It's interesting. Something I hadn't thought about from Amy's remarks is that depending on what the story is or the sort of look and feel of the country in a given year, you know, for instance, emergency books are a lot more interesting right now than they were a few years ago. I have to say, India, Pakistan, and partition books still interesting and an important part of the reading list are relatively less so. But there's no easy answer. If there were, we wouldn't dare tell it. As for the fact of India's extremely large English reading public, I do think there's something there both to our advantage and our disadvantage. There's a very interesting interplay between foreign correspondence about India and the domestic press, such as you don't have in countries with there are millions of Chinese citizens, nationals in China and abroad, who read Western coverage of China obsessively and let you know what they think. But it's not a self-sustaining independent media structure the way that, of course, you have in the Indian English press. And while there's an extreme elite bias there, it's not just the elite that you're connecting with through local coverage. So a very gratifying thing about that sort of overlap in English language coverage is that I think sometimes foreign coverage, which is most often picking up something that first Indian journalists got to, will have some interplay that can be useful or at least interesting. So for instance, thinking of examples when I came here in my current stint, both the so-called Delhi rape case of 2012 and also air pollution, which was not much thought about even in Delhi before I think 2013, 2012. Both of those stories took on a different kind of life in the Indian media environment because of, I would argue, the way that they looked from outside of the country, in particular the comparison between Delhi's air quality and Beijing's air quality, which everyone in the world had by then digested was a public health mechanism, created some momentum that's still building pace here. And as Nimisha was pointing out, there's some pitfalls to thinking through the Indian press space when you then need to turn around and write for your foreign audience. at the level of terminology and just conceptually. Like last week, I was writing something where I was citing this chief minister or that chief minister to an audience that sits, to editors sitting in the UK, an audience that sits around the world, largely in North America. The term means nothing over there. I took for granted that it was a heavyweight designation. I had to be reminded, oh yeah, chief minister, what on earth is that to anyone outside of this country? That's a problem I wouldn't face if I were in Indonesia. I would be thinking as a foreigner all the time.
All right. So last couple of questions. Nimisha, what do you have to say to those who feel let down about the problems, quote unquote, in the country being broadcast to the rest of the world? And to Parul, of late, other countries have been taking a great amount of interest in internal matters of India, whether it is European members of parliament visiting Jammu and Kashmir, or views taken on Article 370 and CAA and NRC. How do you cover such stories? So, yeah. Nimisha, you will go? Yeah.
Okay.
Sure, thanks, Zaka. No, that is definitely a criticism that I have, and I think plenty of foreign journalists have faced a lot. Why are you only covering the sad things, the problematic things? Why aren't we getting more happy stories out of India? There's so much good that is happening. And all of that may well be true, but the challenge here becomes that we are one country being covered around the world. So Deutsche Welle is covering, is in a bulletin, is going to countries, is going to 4 to 6 countries in half an hour. And our contribution perhaps is once a week, twice a week, about what are the most pressing, relevant issues in India. And often, unfortunately, that ends up being what are the major challenges the country is facing, what are the major policy implications of something that has been decided, that has happened via the government, even natural disasters for that matter. You have to pay attention to these things because you're looking at how people are reacting, suffering, dealing with the kinds of challenges that are coming up on a day-to-day basis. Of course, there is an effort even from our own side. There are requests I get over Christmas. Hey, is there anything happy you can report on that we can perhaps look at and feel good about? And we do look for those stories. There are hopeful stories and positive stories that we have done, but we cannot do them at the expense of ignoring important issues that need attention, especially in the environment which we have been discussing, where there's this disparity. And again, as foreign media, especially explaining India to the world, there's an added responsibility that we are looking at these problems, explaining them, getting all the sides in, and not ignoring any of the things which may well be ignored in national media.
All right. Parul, you get the final word.
Yes. So talking about Kashmir, now I would say there are two facets to Kashmir reportage. One is domestic, one is the media, which is reporting on events in Kashmir for Indian newspapers. And then the other part of the media, which is, say, reporting Indian reaction to what the world is saying about what is happening in Kashmir, or what is happening in Assam with regard to the National Register of Citizens, or even against the Citizenship Amendment Bill, Amendment Act, because these are issues that have had the world concerned. In fact, Iran has been very unhappy about the goings on in Kashmir. They've been issuing statements despite India's close ties with Iran. So again, the same thing where the CAA is concerned with regard to Bangladesh. Bangladesh has been repeatedly expressing its concerns. So we, as people, as journalists writing on foreign affairs, do report on this, but it is again largely confined to what country A, or say the EU, has to say. Critical statements on Indian moves on revoking Article 370 or going ahead with CAA. But I think that in terms of the real impact of these legislations, it's reported more by the Indian media reporting on domestic issues rather than the media writing on foreign affairs per se, because it remains confined largely to what the Indian government's responses to these. And I mean, well, these are kind of sanitized responses. They justify revocation of Article 370, or they justify CAA. We've been telling Bangladesh, no, it's not it's not targeting the Bangladeshis. You needn't worry. We're not going to send any illegal Bangladeshi citizens back to Bangladesh. But yes, these do affect our bilateral relationships to a great extent. Again, with Turkey, I mean, our ties have gone south because of Kashmir.
All right. Okay. With that, we come to a conclusion of this first session of the Media Rumble Online, TMR Online. Thank you very much, Parul, Nimisha, Alex, Amy, and Suhasini for joining us on this first panel discussion. For the rest of the participants, I hope it was worth your time. Thank you. With that, I hand it over back to Elizabeth.
Thank you.